going to get started, and I want to thank everybody for coming today and those of you that are coming back here to see the recorded presentation. My name is Jane Lansing, and I chair the League's Reimagining Public Safety Committee. And as the title says, I'm going to be sharing progress to date in the road ahead in public safety. And this is looking back, well, a long time, past 5 years, and looking forward. And it's going to take about 35 minutes, at which point we'll have time for questions and discussions. And we can cover all this material so quickly because this material was put together by our committee of about a dozen League members who've been studying and closely following these events for the last 5 years. So before I start, most of you know about the League, but just to give a little history, we're a 100-year-old nonpartisan voter engagement organization. And although we're nonpartisan, we do have positions, and those positions are developed through rigorous study, and then we adopt them through a consensus process. And our first public safety study was published in 1971, and our most recent one was published by our committee in 2021, and then we updated it in 2024 with updates through April of this year. And this presentation is a summary of that update. There's actually in paper format, an 8-page paper on our website that you can find. And when you listen to anybody talk about public safety, it's important to understand where they are coming from, because everybody comes from a point of view. So the League's position is that we support fair and adequate law enforcement for all people, and measures to ensure equal justice for all persons, regardless of race and socioeconomic status. So we started this because it's an election year, and this is a really powerful time for people to exercise their point of view at the ballot box. But once the election is over, the power of your voice does not end. So keep that in mind. We educate voters, and we are asking Minneapolis residents to pay attention. This is the number 1 or 2 most important issues for voters as we go out and talk to people in the community. So we want you to use this information and use your voice, both at the ballot box and with your elected officials. Usually what we do when we do these presentations in the community, and we've done 14 of them over the spring and summer, we've reached over 300 people, is we ask for a quick show of hands. I'm not going to do that now, but just ask yourself, what do you think about the progress that has been made over the last 5 years in public safety reform? No progress, some progress, or meaningful progress. I will say that when we ask this question in our public events, most people say some progress. Some people say meaningful progress, and a few less say no progress. Our committee really lands on the some progress and leaning into meaningful. We do have hope, and in the course of this presentation, I will show you where we see that hope, but also that there is a lot of work to go. So let's get into what that work is. So this is both a simple overview of the history of public safety in Minneapolis, and also what our presentation is going to cover. Now, the gold flags at the top show on the left-hand side, the 150 years of discriminatory policing. Some say it was even more than that. And on the right-hand side, the 10+ years of reform, and probably more than that. And under the timeline, you see with the murder of George Floyd, the changes that have been made. Starting with the changes within the city and MPD, and some of them even going back before, and we'll talk about what those are. With the murder of George Floyd, the state of Minnesota, the Department of Human Rights, started their investigation, and that was followed by a settlement agreement, which is a negotiated legal binding agreement between the city and the state of Minnesota. The Federal Department of Justice also did their own investigation, and that concluded with a negotiated agreement between the city and the DOJ, which is not signed, and we'll also address what's going on with that. The settlement agreement, by the content of that, was an independent monitor was hired, and they developed an implementation plan to address everything within the settlement agreement. And we'll be covering all of these things in this presentation. So as I said, Minneapolis has a long history of police violence. It started way before George Floyd. And when we did our research, we were reading reports going back into, the teens, before that. And all of the reports that we read came up to the exact same conclusions that both the Minnesota Human Rights Department came up with and the federal DOJ report came up with. All of these reports are on our website. Frankly, if you go back and read these initial reports, they're pretty sobering. I love Rebecca Lucero's comment that this is not a case of one bad apple. The data shows that MPD has a pattern or practice of discriminatory race-based policing. And that is what all these reforms are really meant to address. So it's very easy when you think of public safety to point the finger at the police, and much of that is well-deserved, but the landscape is really complex, and knowing where things happen is important because that's where change can happen. So let's start with the city, and then we'll go around clockwise and understand kind of what happens where. So the police and MPD are part of the city government. They're the front line. And they're a big part of public safety ecosystem that includes 911, neighborhood safety, fire. They report to the mayor, but the city council approves their budget, and the police contract and the union define their employment policies. Now, in the county, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office regularly partners with MPD, and particularly when staffing and support levels were low and we needed extra support and staffing. Most social services funding flows through the county, and they provide mental health, addiction, family violence, and support services, and the county attorney brings charges in the case of crime. Now, the state has three main roles. The specific laws impacting police for many of the same policies that Minneapolis changed right after George Floyd was killed, for example, eliminating neck restraints and those types of things. Those were turned into statewide legislation. The state also defines how arbitration is handled with the police union. The Post Board, which is the Peace Officers Training and Standards Board, and you'll hear more about those later on in the presentation, defines training and licensing standards for all peace officers throughout the state. And the Department of Human Rights investigated and is party to the settlement agreement, and they're all part of the state. Now, the federal government can also pass public safety legislation, and that would apply nationwide. They've done very little of that. You've probably heard of the George Floyd Policing Reform Act, which has been sitting sort of languishing in Congress for probably 5 years now. And then lastly, the backdrop is the community under which all this operates. And David Douglas, he is the president of the Independent Monitor, and the name of that organization is ALEFA, Effective Law Enforcement for All, and I'll be saying ALEFA a few times in this presentation. And one of the things that he is fond of saying is that the courts are going to determine the floor of the reform or the minimum compliance, but the community is going to determine the ceiling. So we have a big voice in determining what we demand in who we elect and how we hold our public officials and the appointed officials accountable to meeting our demands. So those in the darker dots here that you see are groups, because one of the things that ALEFA supports is he believes that we can be more effective when we band together to make our voices heard. So this change in public safety structure that has evolved is one of the big reasons that we feel hope about the progress that is being made. If you look at before November 2020 on the left, and if you look at all the functions of public safety, they reported in to all different parts of city government. And then after August of 2022, the Office of Community Safety was formed, and all of the public safety departments reported into the Office of Community Safety. And I want to make three important points here. Number one is culture. Can you imagine how difficult it is to try to change culture when everybody is reporting into a different place. There's really no consistent message or common way to drive culture, who's in charge. Today, our committee has met with Todd Barnett, who is the Commissioner of Community Safety, several times. And very often, one of the first things he'll do when he speaks in public is he pulls out the mission of the Office of Community Safety. He says, this is our mission, this is our values. All of these department heads meet together every Tuesday morning, and they're all pulling in the same direction. So that's really, really important. The second point I want to make is that you, the voters, enabled this change, because when you voted for question number 1 in the 2020 election for the executive mayor and legislative council, that enabled the executive office to study this and make a proposal to create the Office of Community Safety. And this was approved by the city council, so that enabled this. And the third thing that I want to point out is that this structure starts to reflect what experts call a public health approach to public safety. And so to talk more about that, I'm going to let Todd Barnett actually explain what is a public health approach to public safety. Oops. Oh, geez. Hang on a second. Hit the wrong button.
One thing is that just like in health, we want to be data driven. You can find patterns and trends. And so that's one thing. We want to use that data to inform us on where should we as a city be spending our money to get the best results and outcomes for those. One thing that I think is important as well is that, again, we center community and get community's input into things that we think we need to get done, because a lot of times from the government, we tell a community what they want, but instead let's ask community what it is that they need and how can we work together. The other thing, other 2 or 3 things I would say is prevention programs are super important for what we do. I think both Jordan and Candace can talk about that. Collaboration across not only city departments, but county and state departments, bringing departments together for one goal of public health and safety. And we can't deny the focus that we need to have on mental health. Mental health is such a key to what we do. And then lastly, what I would say with this holistic approach here is that we have to consistently evaluate where we are and be adaptive to what our responses can be.
So now let's talk about what has changed. So important steps have been taken in the city. And some of these started even before the murder of George Floyd. We're going to look at them in 3 different areas: in the policy and training, alternatives to police response, and violence prevention programs. So police policy and training. So immediately after the murder of George Floyd, chokeholds were banned. There was a requirement to de-escalate, changes to body camera pages, banning no-knock warrants. You may recall that happened in 2 phases, because the murder of Amir Locke happened after the first sort of a not well executed ban on no-knock warrants, imposing the duty to report the use of excessive tops and things like that. And then the training, eliminating warrior style training, introducing the duty to intervene. There's a training called ABLE, Active Bystander for Law Enforcement training, that was introduced in the Minneapolis Police Department. Reforming the field officer training program. Derek Chauvin was a field training officer. And then in the area of recruiting, at one point, the police department in Minneapolis was 900 officers. It actually shrunk to 500 officers, which resulted in a lot of the dissatisfaction people have seen with call times. Call and response times are still not at a satisfactory level. As far as the police and citizens are concerned. It's back up to 605 today as of about a week ago. Changes have been made to the types of experience that can be used. The post board has allowed, this is that state board that does the licensure, the eligibility of non-citizens, for example, people with their green card that are heading towards citizenship, but have the ability to maybe work in more diverse communities, and also increasing the preference for different types of backgrounds and Minneapolis residency. And on September 29th, about a week ago actually, there were 33 new officers that were added to MPD. There was a graduation. Here's some of the pictures going through of that graduation ceremony. And 29 were recruits and 4 were laterals. And laterals mean officers that are not new to policing, but they were police officers in other jurisdictions and they came to Minneapolis. Some of my colleagues went to the graduation in January and there were 19 new officers and 9 of those were laterals. And Chief O'Hara said, the fact that people are actually coming from other jurisdictions to Minneapolis represents a huge change in the reputation of MPD. And the low staffing also enables a change of the culture because you get a new generation of officers. And so you see some of the attributes, the majority with bachelor's degrees, the different backgrounds, military, construction, healthcare, music, somebody had, very multilingual, diverse. A good portion of them are Minneapolis residents, 27 men, 6 women. So we're starting to see this. This is a much larger class than, again, the one in January, and the next class is larger yet. So we're starting to see the recruiting and the improved reputation of the police pay off. So that's a good thing. So now let's look at alternatives to police response. Now, Minneapolis gets 1,000 911 calls a week. And one of the things that we learned as we were doing our research is that we are calling on the police to do far more than they are actually trained to deal with. Less than 10% of their training is in social work or mediation or medical, yet many of their calls are for domestic disputes and mental health issues and things like that. And so one of the best practices that has emerged across the country is for the use of people who are actually experts in mental health and violence prevention and things like that. And that is really fundamental to this public health approach. And so behavioral crisis response is teams that are experts in that. And we're going to hear a little bit more detail about that in the next slide. But in order to deploy that, we need to change the 911 system. And so the 911 operators have to be trained to be able to dispatch a call and know who to dispatch. Do I dispatch a behavioral crisis person? Do I dispatch an armed officer? And then the 311 system is the ability to dispatch a civilian response. So more administrative type note-taking and follow-up. And so armed officers are not responding to everything. But when we talk about behavioral crisis response, let's let Candace Hansen, who is the executive director of Canopy Roots, explain what is behavioral crisis response.
We provide a behavioral health or mental health first response. That means that we are completely integrated into the 911 system. That means that we have the same computers, same radios, same linkage to 911 that police and fire and all of the other first responder organizations have. There are a lot of different cities that do this type of work, but having this integrated is kind of the gold standard based on the people who study this work. To have that integration makes it easier to communicate and also makes it safer for the responders. One of the things that we focus on when we go out to a call is assessment, right? We're trying to assess what is needed from us, but also we're assessing the individual who is the subject of the call. Our background is mental health, so all of our staff are either mental health practitioners or mental health professionals in the state of Minnesota.
And when we talked with Candace, she said that 70% of the time they go out on their own. They are not with armed officers, and about 30% of the time they will actually either call in or go out with an armed officer. Now violence prevention is another best practice, and it's really about breaking that cycle of violence, either before it begins, at the first sign, or after it happens. And You're probably familiar with those violence interrupter groups. I think of those t-shirt groups. You've seen them on the news. There's those people on the street. They are community groups who grew up in the neighborhood, who know the neighborhood. Some of them actually work in the hospital to respond and work with either victims of violence, their families, things like that. And this is also where, not recently, but a few months ago, you probably saw a lot in the news about the poor accounting practices, the lack of transparency, and all of the things that you saw in the news was absolutely true, because many of these programs started up in haste with the unrest after the murder of George Floyd and the significant drop in the ranks of MPD. And so the city reacted quickly to try to put some resources out there to quell the violence, but did not take the time to put the infrastructure in place to manage. And steps have been taken to address this. And actually, they've made quite a bit of progress in this regard. So let's just take a look at what this violence prevention is by hearing from a violence prevention person. Jordan Nelson is the executive director of Mad Dads.
Mad Dads, as far as the data that we have on record, and when we've even talked to the White House, is the longest standing African American founded and led what we would call CVI organization, so community violence and intervention. We used to train with the Department of Justice out of Washington, D.C. We used to hold contracts with them to train different cities and organizations on how to galvanize volunteers and to go canvas within the community. And training center was actually built in Omaha, Nebraska, where people would come from around the country to learn how to canvas, how to get volunteers, and how to go into the community to create peace, and the drugs, and the violence that was plaguing our community.
And Jordan himself lost a brother to street violence, to gun violence, and he spent 10 years in prison. He came out, got a BA degree, and he is now runs his own church and this organization. And he currently is not contracted with the city. Mad Dads is now working with Hennepin County, but in this effort to kind of raise the bar on the relationship between the city and their contractors, the insurance bar for their contractors was not something that they were able to meet. And so now they're working with the Hennepin County organization. And the city was frankly kind of disappointed with that. I just spoke to Director Harrington about that about a week ago. She said they were quite bummed out because they're a terrific organization, but just wanted to be clear about that. Anyway, if you think about the goal of police reform, it is the process to establish trust in community. And a visible measure of that and that accountability is the complaint process with the police behavior. And so citizen complaints about police behavior go to either one of two places. Now, internal complaints, those are police complaining about the police, so they go into internal affairs. And external complaints, so that's from the community, those go into the Minneapolis Office of Police Conduct Review, which is part of the Civil Rights Department within the city. And these complaints then get reviewed and they get investigated, and then they ultimately go to a review panel, which is composed of 3 community members. There's a community commission on police oversight, civilians, and 2 officers who then make a recommendation and go to the police. Now, this has been a process that has been also fraught with a lot of problems over the years. First of all, with a tremendous lack of leadership, also staffing. At one point, the Office of Police Conduct Review, I think, was down by over 50% of their staffing. Now, a new civil rights leader was put in place and really pulled the process back in place. That got up to full staffing. You know, that leader just recently was offered a new position, which is a bit of a bummer, but they're recruiting right now for a new leader. but progress is really being made. In the last ALIFA report, they had identified 450 historical backlog cases, which are older than 180 days, and they had all been moved into the process, with 280 decided or pending decision, and 100, and the rest of them 170 in investigation. So they're definitely making progress on them, but it's a place that definitely needs work. They've been hiring extra resources to try to move up the investigation, because a lot of the time is between here and here and here and here when they pull all of the records and the body cams and everything, and they actually do the deep investigation. I would say another interesting point is looking at the number of internal complaints over the years. And if I just pulled up the data here, and if you look at the red line is the external community complaints against the police, and the blue line is the internal complaints of police against the police. If you go back like 10 years, the number of community complaints was like easily 10x, or well, here it was probably 400x, because this was like 1, and the community complaints were up to about 400. And today they're approaching to be much closer to each other. And I believe that this, and this is my interpretation only, and I could be wrong, but this is part of that culture shift that's starting to take hold, this active bystander training. When my colleagues and I went to the police graduation in January, the officer that was chosen to do the graduation speech actually said that with his ABLE training, that active bystander training, they learn how to hold each other accountable, because if they do that, they make the police, they make themselves better. So I will point out one thing though, because over the last 2 quarters, this number has gone up. So the next time we as a committee get in front of the police or get in front of ALIFA, this is something we're definitely going to be asking about, because it has been very, very stable for a long time. And then suddenly over the summer, these numbers have gone up. So again, a reason for the community to stay involved and keep pushing and saying what's going on here. So where do we go next? I'd like to say that we have a yellow brick road to reform. If you look at the settlement agreement, it literally, with the implementation plan developed by ALIFA, is a yellow brick road to reform. And now the settlement agreement and the implementation plan that is based on that cover a tremendous amount of the reforms that are needed. The consent decree actually has about 80% of this consent decree requirements, the one that is not implemented, is actually included within the settlement agreement. But there are things in the consent decree that are not included in the settlement agreement. And those things are things associated with more First Amendment, how the press is treated, handling of crowds. And on our website, we have a paper that outlines the difference between the settlement agreement and the consent decree, and what are those 20% things that are not included in the settlement agreement, but that are in the consent decree. Right now, the city council and the city are working to determine how do we take, because the mayor and the city council and the police chief rather have said, we are going to implement every single item of both the consent decree and the settlement agreement. But the question is, how do we get accountability to those incremental items in the consent decree? And they're looking to find a way to do that. The one on the table right now is to add those incremental items to the independent evaluator plan. And so I want to look at the independent evaluator plan and just show you a little bit about it, and then come back to kind of your role in this. So if you look at the settlement agreement, it's a legal agreement. There are 381 paragraphs that are all paragraphs to address the findings of the Minnesota investigative report. This is the implementation plan. And for every single paragraph in the settlement agreement, there is a corresponding line item in the implementation plan that takes that paragraph and said who's responsible and what are we going to do, what, where, what, who, and how. Most of these are the responsibility of MPD will do this, the independent evaluator will do this, some of them are the city, some of them are the city attorney, but it's who's got responsibility for what and what are they going to do and how are we going to evaluate that we are actually meeting the requirements of this. So it is a really comprehensive plan to address every single element of the settlement agreement. And so the proposed plan on the table is to take those incremental elements of the consent decree and just roll them into this implementation plan so that it's held accountable. And as I said, the one requirement of the settlement agreement is for community involvement, and that they are always holding regular meetings and pulling in and trying to engage and pull people involved. So they've got a multi-year plan, and I think the most important part of this slide is the title. Systemic change requires a systemic approach. So they've got this multi-year plan to achieve compliance. MPD, the city, the state, and the community are all parties. They finished the first year in March, and there is a report out on it. And 3 times a year, ALIFA comes here and they hold a public meeting and they explain what they've done and they take questions and have just an open dialogue with the community to say, what's going on? How pleased are you with this or not pleased? And it's a very open process. So year 1 accomplishments, because if you go back here and look, the basis, the foundational phase it's not very exciting. It's rewriting policies. It's looking at officer wellness. It's looking at technology systems. And frankly, if you have been harmed by this system of excessive violence, this is really, really not satisfying, but it's extremely important to redo these things. You can't train on policies unless you've redone the policies. And so the first year, these are all the policies that have been redone and rewritten. Every time a policy gets rewritten, it gets put out public. The public can come in and comment on it. The training that has been completed. This is the progress on the complaint backlog we talked about. There is a development plan for a data systems plan because the systems are well out of reach. One of the problems with progressing the complaints is that it's very hard to pull together all of the information about a complaint because they're buried in different places and it's even hard to know where they are. And then officer wellness, when we look at what's going to be needed in the future, facilities, technology and equipment is going to be an important investment for the future. So year 2, it's going to be just sort of continuing on the same, starting more training, holding people accountable, starting to develop what the metrics are, putting audits and dashboards together. And then long term is really looking for that accountability and the community to engage and become part of maintaining and sustaining this change long after ALIFA is gone and the policies are done, but we have to keep this accountability going for the long term. So it's an election year. Ultimately, the mayor who's elected is responsible for police reform. So, and he also appoints the public officials who are on the ground doing that work every time. So Todd Barnett, the Commissioner of Public Safety, Chief O'Hara, Amanda Harrington runs the Department of Public Safety. This is the open position in the Department of Public Rights, in the Civil Rights rather, and LaTanya Reeves chairs the Community Commission on Police Oversight, who reviews those complaints. You can talk to all the mayoral candidates on Thursday, October 16th, because the League of Women Voters has a mayoral meet and greet. So they are all there. You can ask them about your public safety questions so you can determine who you want to vote for. The council is elected and they are responsible for the budget and the oversight of government functions. So they are determining where the money goes, who gets allocated the money, and on a quarterly basis, many of these programs go before the city council and they present them to the city council to make sure that they can get their money and get funding. So everybody should know their ward and representatives, and you can go to the league website to see the candidate forums for all the wards, because every one of these wards, the city council is up for election this year. And you have a tremendous amount of opportunity to make sure you are voting and holding your city council person accountable for what you want out of public safety. So your role is to attend the forums, ask your candidate questions, and vote for those who you think best represent you. This year, before the election, after the election, throughout the year, contact the mayor, contact your city council person, let your officials know your thoughts and concerns about public safeties. They respond to the community. You can sign up and get on the police reform update, because the police have an implementation unit that has been formed to develop all of these reforms. Attend a public meeting. Alifa does 3 of those a year. The next one will be in November. MPD sends out notices of their engagement meetings, because their implementation team also meets with the community. If you have sign up for your city council person's newsletter, because most city council people at least once a year will have a public safety focused community meeting of some sort. And in April, the League of Women Voters did a civic buzz on public safety beyond armed police response. So you can see a broader interview with the 3 people that we had featured in the little snippets here. These are the questions that we think are important to ask. What progress, if any, in public safety have you seen over the last 4 years? And what are your top priorities for the next 4 years? Because what they see as progress looking back is going to really inform what they're going to prioritize as they legislate going forward and lead. And then if elected, how will you approach funding for the settlement agreement? Because we have a path, we have a clear path. The settlement agreement, the consent decree, the implementation plan by Alifa were unanimously approved by the mayor and all 13 city council people. We have a plan and a path. We have to execute it. And it's going to be a long period of execution. What does funding mean? These are some of the things that are needed to be funded. We have to fund the Alifa contract. We've put new headcounts in. FTEs are full-time equivalents. We've put people in the police department. We've put people in the county attorney's office, IT, the civil rights department, the Community Commission on Police Oversight. We've put external resources in to help go through some of those outstanding backlogs of complaints. We've got help writing the policies. And I think one of the bigger costs that are going to be coming up is going to be improvements to infrastructure and IT. They're doing the audits and things now, but to just elevate what we have for IT and infrastructure. So some of the engagement opportunities to become part of one of those groups that brings a louder voice together. Join the League of Women Voters, the Minnesota Justice Research Center, get engaged with the LIFA, Minneapolis for a Better Police Contract, Communities United Against Police Brutality, the Unity Community Mediation Fund, and then neighborhood safety groups we've had a lot of people that came to our public meetings on this that learned about it through their neighborhood community safety clubs. So with that, I want to thank you for participating. I want to give a quick thanks to all of our Reimagining Public Safety committee members. So that's our credits here. And then we have time to go to the Q&A. So I think I'm going to just stop sharing now. And if people want to raise hands, ask questions. Or give comments or whatever.
I wanted to express oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks, Jane. Awesome job. Go ahead.
I just wanted to express my admiration for this information being consolidated together. And I also just really wanted to express a deep appreciation for how like apolitical it is. This is a very easy thing to get, politics involved about people's opinions on the different things here. And I feel like this was a very comprehensive and apolitical way of framing the facts and how all of this stuff is organized. So just like deep appreciation to the committee who put this together.
Well, thank you.
And thank you, Patrick, for coming. I appreciate that. Patrick serves on the Lyndhurst board. I invited him because I would like for Lyndhurst to actually host this workshop for our community. And so, Patrick, I thank you very much for coming.
And Patrick pointed out in the chat that you can also attend public meetings of the CCPO, which we have done. And that's another way to get your voice heard, and you can sign up to make comments when you attend any of those public meetings or hearings at the city council that cover this topic.
Yeah, that's actually, I want to echo what Susan just said, because I have to say, we have been guilty of being good auditors and watchers until we were talking to Commissioner Barnett one time, and he said, if you have a stand up, because having all points of view, heard is really important. And, so if you, even if your point of view is just, we agree, because otherwise you only get extremes. And to stand up and have your voice heard. And we really took that to heart. So you have to sign up on those little sheets to get your 2 minutes in.
So Jane, I say thank you too. Also, great job. I'm glad we're recording this. The challenge is always to get it out there. If anybody has any creative ideas about how we can get this information, I think it's really important for people to hear about it before the election and as they're interacting with candidates. This is always our biggest challenge. We've got this great thing, but how do we get it out there? So welcoming your ideas.
And if people have continuing questions after they see this, after it's been recorded and uploaded to the website, they can certainly contact us. I don't know what's the best way, or maybe when we do post this, we can have an email listed for people who have further questions, because we're always happy to address those and see if we can find an answer. And if not, we will try and do the research.
Right, because even I know because we've gotten questions after doing these in the libraries, and a number of questions have come into to Anne in the office. People will send it to either Vote or at Legal Women Voters, just our standard website, and they always come to me. So I think however you write to Legal Women Voters, that gets to the right person. And I would say another thing in terms of getting it out to people, like Patrick, you have a community organization. Because one of the things we did a bunch of library presentations, so we've done pretty much all the corners of the city, and where we tended to get a lot of people was when we went into sort of like a high rise or a community, a place where there's already a group of people that are organizing. To try to get people to randomly come is a little more difficult, like in the wild. I say like grabbing people in the wild is harder. But if people are already organizing around a neighborhood or some other kind of a community event or some other organization, purpose-driven organization, and if this information fits with that purpose-driven organization.
I just want to say that this is very valuable information. I'm in the Minneapolis League, but I live in Minnetonka. And people who live in the suburbs and have a view of Minneapolis, how things are going, it makes a huge difference to them if they can understand the things that you are presenting about police reform in Minneapolis. You know, they work there and they have to go there. Then my daughters have to go into Minneapolis to go to work. And people are being required to there and access parts of Minneapolis, like light rail and things like that. So they need to understand how police reform is going, public safety reform is happening in Minneapolis, which is sort of a core area. So not just for voters, you know, but for people who are living their part of their days, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point, Susan. I don't know how they would how this would get to them. But maybe on the website might be an easier way for them to access it if they're really interested.
There could be that, or maybe we can encourage the leagues around who are in the suburbs, you know, to share this information somehow. It's not just a voting issue, I don't think.
It's not. I have said I think we're going to be doing this presentation for the next 10 years. You know, it's not going to go away. I think it's one of these things where you just have to keep constant.
One of the interesting things, Jane, is if you combine all the presentations at libraries that we did, we actually had something like 4 or 5 city council candidates and several mayoral candidates attend to learn about this stuff. So it was really very satisfying.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
So Jane, we may be done here.
I think we might be.
Yay!
There's no more questions. So